The day the protection was lifted. What if the worst moment of your life didn't begin on earth, but in a place you could never see? What if your pain was not punishment, not failure, not abandonment, but the echo of a conversation that happened beyond time, beyond human reach? Tonight, we step into one of the most unsettling and powerful stories ever recorded. A story that asks a dangerous question. What happens when a good man loses everything? Not because he is guilty, but because he is faithful? The Bible speaks, quietly but firmly, about a protection most people never notice. It is not a wall you can touch, not a lock you can hear, not a shield you can see. Scripture describes it as a kind of invisible boundary, a spiritual covering placed by God himself around a person's life, their home, their future. A protection that does not make noise, but holds back forces far older and darker than we like to imagine. Most people live their entire lives never knowing it exists. But there was one man whose protection was noticed, and because it was noticed, it was challenged. His name was Job. To his neighbors, Job was simply a successful man, respected, generous, deeply religious. To his community, he was a pillar of stability in an uncertain world. In an ancient economy where wealth was measured not in coins but in living creatures, Job stood at the very top. He owned thousands of sheep, caravans of camels, fields that fed entire regions. But what set Job apart was not his wealth. It was his character. The ancient text describes him with rare precision. Blameless, upright, someone who turned away from evil. Not perfect, but sincere. Not naive, but vigilant. Job lived as if the world were dangerous because he believed it was. Even when nothing seemed wrong, he prayed. Even when his children celebrated, he offered sacrifices. Not because they had sinned, but because they might have, even in thought. Job believed something deeply, that integrity builds a wall, that obedience creates space between the human soul and destruction. And for a long time, he was right. His home stood untouched. His family flourished. His influence grew. From the outside, Job's life looked like proof that faith works. But somewhere beyond human sight, something else was happening, a conversation beyond earth. While Job was tending his household, while prayers rose quietly for his land, while sacrifices burned in humble devotion, his name was spoken in a place no human could enter. The Bible pulls back the curtain for just a moment, not to satisfy curiosity, but to unsettle us. It describes a gathering beyond the physical world, a council, a moment where spiritual beings stood before God. And among them came an intruder, not a monster, not a caricature, not a horned creature from folklore, but an intelligent, watchful presence, one who had been walking the earth, observing humanity closely. When God spoke first, he did not ask about wars or kingdoms. He asked about a man. Have you considered my servant Job? It was not a challenge. It was a statement of confidence. But the response that followed would reshape Job's life forever. The accuser did not deny Job's goodness. He attacked its motive. Does Job fear God for nothing? In that question lies one of the darkest accusations ever spoken about the human heart. The suggestion was simple and devastating. Job isn't faithful because he loves you. Job is faithful because you protect him. Take away the hedge, and his devotion will collapse. The accuser pointed to the invisible barrier around Job's life, the protection that kept disaster at bay, and claimed it was the only reason Job stood upright. And then came the unthinkable. God allowed the challenge, not because Job was weak, but because his faith was real, with a single boundary, that Job's life itself could not be taken. The protection was lifted. No thunder struck. No warning was sent. No dream disturbed Job's sleep. On earth, everything looked the same. But spiritually, Job was now exposed. The calm before the collapse. This is perhaps the most terrifying part of the story. Job woke up that morning unaware that the rules had changed. He kissed his children goodbye. He oversaw his lands. He lived an ordinary day, protected no longer, but not yet touched. And that is how disaster often begins, not with alarms, but with silence. What followed was not chaos. It was strategy. The ancient record describes a chain of events so precise, so relentless, that it feels almost military in execution. Attack after attack, loss after loss. No pause long enough to breathe, as if something had been waiting patiently for permission, and when that permission came, it moved fast. A man reduced to ashes. By nightfall, the wealth that had taken decades to build was gone, fields destroyed, herds stolen or burned, servants killed, and then the final blow. All 10 of Job's children, gathered together in a moment of joy, were buried beneath falling walls and violent wind. In a single day, Job became something unrecognizable. The most powerful man in the region became a grieving father with no heirs. The question was no longer what had been taken. The question was what would remain. In ancient culture, grief had rituals. Clothing was torn, hair was shaved, ashes were signs of surrender to sorrow. Job did all of it, but instead of cursing heaven, he bowed. The Lord gave, he said, and the Lord has taken away. It was not denial, it was defiance, and it stunned the unseen observer who had expected something very different. Why this story matters. The story of Job is not about suffering alone. It is about why suffering exists even in faithful lives. It challenges the idea that pain is always punishment. It confronts a belief that obedience guarantees safety. It exposes a danger of shallow faith built only on blessing. Job did not suffer because he failed. He suffered because his faith could withstand examination. And this is where the story truly begins. Because losing everything around you is one thing. But what happens when suffering moves inside you? What happens when pain becomes personal, when faith is no longer theoretical, when God feels silent? That question leads us into the next chapter of Job's journey, where the battle shifts from loss to endurance, to truth itself. And as we move forward, we will discover that the greatest test was not what Job lost, but what he refused to become. When faith is no longer silent. The day after everything collapsed, the world did not stop. The sun still rose. The wind still moved through the land. Life went on, just not for Job. Loss has a strange way of making time feel uneven. Moments stretch into hours, and hours vanish without warning. For Job, grief did not arrive all at once. It settled into him, slowly, like dust after a ruined building falls. And then the suffering deepened, because losing everything around you is devastating. But losing your own body changes the nature of pain. When the battle turns inward, the ancient text tells us that the accuser returned again to that unseen place beyond the world, not humbled, not repentant, but calculating. Material loss had not broken Job, so the argument changed. Skin for skin, the accuser said, an old expression from a marketplace, a way of saying that a person will surrender anything external to protect their own life. Take away comfort, take away health, and faith will collapse. This time, the permission went deeper. Job's body, once strong, respected, capable, became the next battlefield. Pain entered him without warning. Not a single wound, not a passing illness, but a condition so consuming that it touched every nerve, every movement, every breath. Pain from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Ulcers, inflammation, burning irritation that never rested. Sleep became impossible. Relief became a memory. The man who once sat among leaders now sat outside the city. On ash heaps were refused and the unwanted were thrown. Not because someone banished him, but because suffering has a way of pushing people to the margins on its own. Job scraped his skin with broken pottery. Not for drama, not for ritual, but because pain demands response. Because when the body screams long enough, dignity becomes optional. This was not poetic suffering. It was raw, the loneliest kind of pain. But physical pain was not the deepest wound. That came from the voice closest to him. Job's wife had lost everything too. 10 children, security, future. The life she believed in was gone. Her grief did not take the shape of worship. It took the shape of exhaustion. She looked at Job's ruined body and said what many people think but rarely admit. Do you still hold on to your integrity? Curse God and die. It sounds cruel, but it wasn't hatred. It was despair. In her mind, faith had failed. God had become the source of pain, not protection. Death felt like mercy. Job did not respond with anger. He responded with clarity. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Not because he enjoyed suffering, not because he understood it, but because he refused to reduce God to a transaction. Even now, Job's faith was not blind. It was stubbornly honest when help finally arrives. Eventually, word reached beyond the city. 3 men heard what had happened. Not strangers, but companions from Job's former life. Men of wisdom, influence, reputation. They came with the intention to comfort, and when they first saw him, they failed to recognize him. The disease, the weight loss, the deformity of pain had changed Job so completely that the man they loved looked like someone else entirely. They wept aloud. They tore their garments. They threw dust into the air, ancient signs of shared grief. And then something extraordinary happened. They sat with him for 7 days, 7 nights. No speeches, no explanations, no theology, just presence. And in that silence, they did the only thing that truly helped. But silence never lasts. When comfort turns into judgment, eventually the pressure broke. Job spoke first, not against God, but against existence itself. He cursed the day of his birth. He wished that darkness had claimed him before life could. It was not rebellion. It was grief finding language. But to his friends, it sounded dangerous because their world operated on a simple belief. God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. That belief had always worked until Job. So they began to talk. And with every word, compassion slipped further away. Eliphaz spoke first, calm, reasonable, terrifyingly logical. Who has ever perished being innocent? It was not an accusation shouted in anger. It was worse, a conclusion spoken calmly. If you suffer, you must have sinned. If God is just, then your pain proves guilt. Bildad followed, sharper, less careful. He suggested that Job's children died because of their own wrongdoing. Imagine hearing that after burying every child you had. Zoph would later imply that Job deserved even worse. They were not cruel men. They were certain men. And certainty, when wrong, can be brutal. A courtroom without evidence. Job found himself trapped. If he agreed with them, he would be lying, confessing sins he had not committed just to end the argument. If he disagreed, he appeared arrogant, as though claiming to be more righteous than God. This was not a conversation anymore. It was a trial, and the verdict had already been decided. Job realized something devastating. Even good people can become instruments of injustice when protecting an idea matters more than protecting a person. So he stopped defending himself to them and did something unheard of, calling God to court. Job turned his attention upward, not in blasphemy, not in mockery, but in demand. He wanted to speak directly to God, not as a rebel, but as a defendant asking for charges to be read. He used legal language. He prepared his case. He asked for answers. But God was silent. Job searched for him everywhere, forward, backward, left, right. Nothing. The silence hurt more than the sores, because unanswered pain feels like rejection. And in that silence, Job voiced one of the most human longings ever written. He wished for a mediator, someone who could stand between God and man, someone who could touch both sides, a bridge, hope from the ashes. And then, unexpectedly, hope broke through, not optimism, not relief, but conviction. I know that my Redeemer lives. The word he used was ancient, Goel, a family defender, one who restores what has been lost. Job believed that even if his body failed completely, justice would not. He believed that God, the same God he felt wounded by, would also be the one to vindicate him. This was not logical hope. It was defiant hope, and it carried him forward. When God finally speaks, the silence did not end gently. It ended with a storm. A violent whirlwind rose on the horizon, and from within it, a voice, not an explanation, a challenge. God did not answer Job's questions. He asked his own, "Where were you when the foundations of the earth were laid? Can you command the morning? Do you control the boundaries of chaos?" God expanded the frame. Job wanted answers about pain. God showed him the complexity of existence, not to humiliate, but to recalibrate. Job realized that his understanding of justice was too small to measure the universe. And then God spoke of monsters. Behemoth, raw strength beyond control. Leviathan, chaos itself, untamable by human hands. And God declared something shocking. These forces answer to him. What terrifies humanity is restrained by God. Job understood. The world was not out of control. He simply was not in control. The silence after the storm. Job had nothing left to say. He did not receive reasons. He received perspective. And that was enough. He placed his hand over his mouth. Not in fear, but in humility. The debate ended, and something deeper began. Where this leads. Because now the question was no longer whether Job was innocent. The question was what God would do next. Would justice fall? Would restoration come? Would suffering have a final word? What followed would redefine righteousness, forgiveness, and the true nature of reward. And it begins not with punishment, but with prayer. When restoration does not look the way we expect, the storm faded as suddenly as it had arrived. The wind loosened its grip on the land. The dust settled. The sky, once torn open by thunder, grew quiet again. And Job was left standing there, not healed, not restored, not wealthy, but changed. He had demanded answers. What he received was presence. And sometimes that is the difference between surviving and surrendering, a silence filled with meaning. After God finished speaking, there was no applause from heaven. No explanation followed. No summary statement wrapped the moment neatly. There was only silence. But it was not the empty silence Job had feared before. This silence was heavy with meaning. Job did not argue. He did not defend himself. He did not ask another question. He simply said, I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. This was not shame. It was clarity. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, Job understood his place in the story. Not as a victim of chaos, and not as a judge of God, but as a created being standing before the Creator. And that understanding changed everything. Seeing God, not just knowing about Him. Job had always believed in God. He had prayed. He had obeyed. He had sacrificed faithfully. But belief had been distant. Now it was personal. I had heard of you, Job said, but now my eyes have seen you. Not physically, not visually, but spiritually. Suffering had stripped away borrowed faith, the kind built on tradition, reward, and expectation, and replaced it with something deeper, a faith that does not need explanations to survive. This was a turning point, not because Job was healed, but because he was transformed. An unexpected verdict. Job expected judgment. So did his friends. After all, Job had questioned God openly. He had demanded answers. He had spoken with boldness that bordered on audacity. If anyone deserved rebuke, it was him. But when God finally spoke again, his attention turned, not to Job, but to the three men who had defended him so passionately. And what he said stunned them. I am angry with you, God told them, because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. This moment changes everything. For chapters, these men had insisted that God always rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. They had believed they were protecting divine justice. But they were wrong. They spoke accurately about doctrine, but falsely about God's heart. They valued explanation over compassion, system over empathy, certainty over truth. Job's questions had been honest. Their answers had been hollow. When the wounded becomes the intercessor, then came the instruction no one expected. God told the friends to bring sacrifices, not to him directly, but to Job, and Job would pray for them. The man who sat in ashes, the man they accused, the man they misunderstood. He was now their mediator. This is one of the quiet miracles of the story. God did not restore Job when the storm ended. He did not restore Job when the argument stopped. The text says restoration began when Job prayed for his friends. The men who had wounded him emotionally, the men who had called him guilty, the men who had added shame to suffering. Forgiveness was not optional. It was the doorway. The cost of forgiveness. Imagine the moment. Job, still weak, still scarred, still mourning, standing before the men who hurt him most, and choosing to intercede for them. This was not justice as revenge. This was justice as release. Forgiveness did not erase what happened. It did not minimize the damage, but it broke the final chain tying Job to his pain. And only then did the story turn. Restoration begins quietly. The Bible does not describe restoration as a spectacle. It begins subtly. Relationships reconnect. Relatives return. Gifts appear quietly. Healing takes time, but it comes. Job's strength returns. His body recovers. His life begins again. And when blessing returns, it does not return halfway. Everything doubles, not as a reward for patience, but as a testament to endurance. 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, fields restored, honor renewed, and then children, new life, 7 sons, 3 daughters. The text lingers here. Their beauty is described. Their inheritance is named, because this restoration was not just economic. It was relational, what was not restored. But there is something the story does not say. It does not say Job forgot his suffering. Scars did not disappear just because life improves. Job's restoration did not erase memory. It redeemed it. Those scars became reminders, not a defeat, but a survival. Why Job's story still speaks. Job's story refuses to give us simple answers. It does not promise that faith prevents suffering. It does not claim pain is always deserved. It does not guarantee explanations. Instead, it offers something deeper. It shows us a God who allows questions, a God who values honesty over performance, a God who remains sovereign even when silent. Job was not praised for silence. He was honored for truth. The invisible battle revisited. Remember how the story began, with an unseen conversation, with an accusation about human faith, with a question: does anyone love God for who he is, not for what he gives? By the end of the story, that question is answered. Yes, one man did. Job lost wealth, health, family, reputation, but he did not lose himself. And in that, he won a battle far greater than he ever knew he was fighting. What this means for us. Most of us will never sit on an ash heap, but we will sit in grief, in confusion, in silence. We will ask why prayers seem unanswered, why good people suffer, why God feels distant. Job reminds us that faith is not proven in comfort. It is revealed in conflict, and that God is not offended by honest pain. He is present in it. The final legacy of Job. Job lived a long life afterward, not defined by suffering, but shaped by it. He died satisfied, not because life was easy, but because it was real. His story remains not as a warning, but as an invitation to trust beyond understanding, to speak honestly before God, to forgive when it feels impossible, and to believe that even when the protection feels gone, God has never left.